Tickets are on sale now for Spotlight On's next live event, this time at the Royal Room in Seattle, Washington on June 22nd. Spotlight On, Improvisation in Music and Life will be a unique program of performance and conversation between me and the James Falzone Division Ensemble. Together, we'll explore the nature of improvisation in music and how its principles can be useful in all aspects of life, for musicians and non-musicians alike. Different types of composing in the moment will be demonstrated, interspersed with interludes of discussion covering what each musician brings to and gets from the experience. In the Q&A session, audience members will become participants and access a rare opportunity to gain deeper insight into the art and science of improvisation. For tickets and other information, visit theroyalroomseattle.com. For those of you who cannot join us in person, we'd still welcome and appreciate your support in the form of a ticket purchase. If you can, please do. It would mean the world to us and to this important independent venue. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on bassist and vocalist Katie Ernst. In addition to many other things, Katie is one half of the duo Wayfaring, with last week's guest James Falzone. Katie is also co-leader of the Chicago-based jazz trio Twin Talk, the indie rock band Edith Judith, and has garnered much acclaim for her Dorothy Parker poetry song cycle Little Words, which premiered at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Katie is a true working musician, performing as part of many jazz and improvised music ensembles in the Chicago area. She's also a committed educator, working with young musicians in her work as a teaching artist for the Jazz Institute of Chicago's Jazz Master Residency program in Chicago Public Schools, and by serving on the faculty at Birch Creek Music Academy summer program. I was very fortunate to see Katie perform as part of Wayfaring earlier this year, and even more fortunate to have this conversation. Enjoy. You're very busy.
No, yeah.
I looked at the calendar on your website and it's really something. I mean, it's incredible. I would imagine it's hectic and satisfying and all the good things and all the crazy things, but what's your experience like? How does it feel?
It feels really great. The pandemic gave us all a pause, and in some ways that made a lot of things that were in my regular schedule fall away and left room for other things to come up. Seems to be a season of a lot of playing and traveling. It's fun. It's cool.
Yeah, that's wonderful. When I saw you out here with James as part of Wayfaring, I recall that you had borrowed a bass locally.
Yep. Yes.
Is that common? Is it too difficult to travel with such a machine?
Totally. I live in Chicago, so unless I'm doing something in the Midwest where it's a driving situation, there's a gracious network of other bass players. And it's pretty risky to ship a bass, and it's expensive. Yeah, so I often will play a different instrument when I'm out and about. Something
that struck me, because I think you mentioned that sort of at the tail end of the gig when you were wrapping up and saying thank yous to everyone. And something that struck me was just the fact that you and James don't play that frequently. It seems to be like bursts of activity because of geography and other issues. Yet there's such a beautiful interplay between each of you on your own instruments and voice, as well as with each other. I'm very curious about, like, how do you just pick up somebody else's bass like that? It seems like such an intimate relationship. I guess it's part of being a professional, but I don't know. It really struck me as it added to the magic of it.
Yeah, I mean, each bass is different. There's no standard size for bass. So even a bass that's technically a 3/4 size will be like string length will be different, or the distance from string to string, the size of the body, it's all a variable. When I have a bass that's not mine, I will just play a set of scales to figure out where the notes are and how far it goes. You just get oriented. I have a set thing that I'll do, just understand where the notes are. In some ways, it shows you there's different qualities in different instruments that you can exploit. Like the bass I played in Seattle had a really nice kind of growly low situation. And so that might influence where James and I go in a improvised direction. It gives you a slightly different palette to work with.
I bet. Do you ever get bass envy? Do you have to give one back and you're like, oh, I'm coming back through town for that one?
Yeah. Or you're like, oh, I didn't know that it could feel like that. Or, oh, this one is really, or even like an amp. Oh, what are your settings? Yeah. So you can definitely get inspiration for setup and stuff like that from our bass.
As someone who performs and records with so many different configurations and ensembles, in your self-conception, is there one project that's like your main project and everything else is aside to that? Or are all projects created equal? Or?
I mean, there are some longstanding projects that I feel great ownership of. I have a band called Twin Talk with drummer Andrew Green and saxophonist Dustin Lorenzi. And we've been a band for like 12 years and we've made a bunch of records. And that's a very meaningful project and something that's had we've put a lot of miles on it and we keep evolving projects. So that's a long-term one. But it also is really exciting to be a part of other people's orbit and bands, and they have different shelf lives. Maybe it's just for a record and maybe it's for a longer thing. But yeah, I kind of like the varying levels of not commitment, but of maybe like lifespan of different bands. It's like visiting a friend or something like that.
It's really interesting that some projects can be these sort of ongoing collaborations that span space and time, and others have or can be allowed to have a natural lifespan, especially in the instrumental or jazz world where people come together, make a record or do some dates, and that may be it.
Yeah, and that's really how our Wayfaring band started, was a pickup improvised duo set, a short set. So I think James and I both we didn't go into it thinking, let's start a long-term, like long-distance band. But yeah, sometimes the chemistry of an ensemble will make it more than just the casual meeting of improvisers.
But before I ask you more about Wayfaring, I wanted to return to Twin Talk for a second. Those records that you have up on Bandcamp, it's really beautiful and unique music. Could you tell me a little bit about, if there's an answer to the question, is there a lineage that you see that band in? It seems so unique to me. And I wonder do you set it in any kind of a context or lineage?
I think when we first started playing, we were all in our like early 20s and we had just moved to Chicago and we're just making kind of modern jazz. Like the Fly Trio was like a big influence. And then I think being in the place of Chicago, being around more of the improvised music scene, started to have its seeping influence. I also did this, it's called the Betty Carter Jazz Ahead program at the Kennedy Center in DC. It's for young composer performers. And so I got to be around Jason Moran, and he had his band, the Bandwagon, as part of the faculty. And that had a big influence on me in watching how a trio could interact and be very much independent voices, be very flexible, have a lot of trust in how they were playing and just talking to each other. I brought that back very specifically to our band. And I remember sitting on the floor in rehearsal and being like, guys, I was just in DC and like, I saw this vibe of a band and it's really free and they can go in any direction. And I feel like we should go there. That kind of changed the question that we were asking as a band, instead of like, how do we play a good version of a composed song that we wrote, to like, what can we do with that song to make things perpetually alive and risky and changing. So yeah, that was a big moment in the band's trajectory, was when we made the rules of the game more about hinging open songs and finding places where things can be surprising and unexpected.
I love saxophone trio or saxophone based trios. It's such an amazing vehicle. It's exciting when they get fiery, but there's also this ability to explore delicacy in that format that is really special.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, clearly.
There's a lot of textural possibilities in a chordless trio format. And Dustin is a real colorist. And then Andrew he really has very specific cymbal sounds and toys and things it's a very sound focused band. From most scrunky to very delicate is all in play. Yeah.
When I look across some of your other projects, it seems as though Dustin in particular is one of those characters that he can pick up almost any instrument and make it have sound. At least that's my impression from reading the credits. While I admire it so much, it makes me infuriated.
Yeah.
His synth work is beautiful though. And is it Edith Judith? That again, I think if there's a meta theme that emerges for me listening to all your different projects is just, there's such a sonic palette, and vibe is the wrong word. It's not a great word, but there's a sensuousness, a really nice, analog warmth to all your projects. There's just, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. We, especially for the Edith Judith band, we would refer to the different songs as what kind of sound world they would have. It'd be overall, what's the sound world of this record? And it turned out to be a real combination of the acoustic real instrument sound, and then a very specific synth palette. So kind of like the real and the surreal were twined together in a pretty intentional way. Thinking about sound worlds a lot.
What was the sound world you grew up with? What was young Katie listening to?
I'm smiling because I grew up with really supportive parents that weren't particularly into music. They didn't dislike it, but it just wasn't they didn't have a super deep collection of stuff or anything. So I remember being in the brown two-toned Aerostar minivan and listening to, this is true, a Kenny G cassette tape that they got at a gas station.
Wow.
And it was fine. I was vibing to it, whatever. But I also have all these fake memories of what I thought my parents liked. I thought my dad really liked the Temptations, but I think maybe he just said he knew what that band was, or he knew a song. And in my mind, okay, my dad likes the Temptations. I like them too. So I got into jazz music on a whim. I remember going to the library a lot and just checking out a bunch of CDs and putting them on my Walkman or whatever, So yeah. I think I was just given a lot of space to go do whatever. And I spent a lot of time just blindly listening to a lot of different jazz music because that was what was in disc replay or in the jazz section of the library. I just took a lot in and then learned about it after the fact.
Yeah. When you walk into the library and you're exploring the CDs, can you take yourself back? Well, let me preface this by saying I remember very similar experiences. The format was different. They were LPs, but I can very explicitly remember going to the public library. I actually got scolded because I came home with a pile of records instead of a pile of books. I loved reading. I still do. It was never it was no statement of rebellion on my part, but records are records like that. I'm going to get sucked in. And so I very specifically remember two things. Having some vague familiarity with an artist name. So it's I'll grab that one. And then, of course, just being enchanted by the world of the album art and the covers and being I don't know what's going on there, but I'm going to take a peek inside. Jazz isn't obvious, though, right? So what grabbed you?
That one, I'm still not. I'll look back someday and be this was the moment. I think it was one of those weird kid things where I just heard the word or something, or at some point in my little brain, I decided I like jazz. And my parents were okay, here's go for it. I started playing the double bass when I was 9 in public music school program. I think I thought it was cool that the bass player played in the orchestra and the jazz band. So I'm maybe that was what seemed, I liked how they were going from thing to thing. Once I heard it and a little bit of it, and I think it was reinforced of this is cool. I like to be in this sound world. I feel like I ended up with a lot of compilation CDs because that's what people give away at Disc Replay and places like that. So I remember getting a nice sampler of, there was a Dizzy Gillespie recording of a song. It's like a shanty in old shanty town or something. And it had this kind of guitar Brazilian beat to it. And I was just obsessed. So I listened to it, that one song, a lot. I just liked how that sounded. And I would listen to the intro a lot. And Billie Holiday singing Solitude on some like women in jazz voice compilation, like thinking about it. Yeah. I think I just liked this. I liked the sounds I was hearing. I didn't have a real deep guide of like, you should check this out and you should do this. And this is why this is cool. And I think I really appreciate that now that I had this kind of uninfluenced, just absorption of different kinds of sound palettes. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the idea of the lack of context around this music discovery that way. I can remember the radio played a big role of that, like everything from the weird stations down at the left end of the dial all the way on up through classic rock and public radio, and just listening to so much stuff and not really understanding and never caring about a difference between like high and low art or avant-garde and mainstream. And it was just all sound and music and voices coming from somewhere else. I cherish that so much to think back on it. Certainly don't fetishize it, but just so grateful to have had that. But the other thing that's really interesting is you talked about all those compilations, all those CD compilations. And as you were talking about it, the thought that popped in my head was that was somebody's job. Like now, we all get to make compilations where we're these playlist auteurs. And I guess we had it with mixtapes. But the idea that like somebody got up in the morning, took a shower, ate breakfast, had coffee, went to the office and was like, I have to make the ultimate women in jazz compilation from our catalog. What do we have? That's a great gig. I dig that. Unless they didn't care. unless they weren't into women in jazz.
I wonder if it was less romantic and more functional, but we'll say it was somebody really was dilated.
It was the dream. It was the dream. So 9, standing there next to the double bass. I'm not totally familiar with Eastman. I mean, I know of Eastman, but I don't know a lot about what the pathway is or the curricula are. Did you have to study the classical canon as well as jazz, or was it more conservatory Western classical tradition?
Eastman is historically like classical music conservatory. When I was going there, I was accepted as a jazz double bass major. But for the first 2 years, they have you study with the classical professor and do classical music. I think at the time it was like so that you could then prove that you could play music and then you could go play jazz. It was like kind of a holdover from a different time, I think. But it since has flipped so that jazz majors study jazz for 4 years. But for me, that was awesome because I didn't have a super intense classical bass training. I played in orchestra. I took bass lessons to get ready for my classical audition for college, but I was pretty green on the facility and that style of playing with a bow and playing like super shreddy melodies. I feel bad for the very established double bass professor that had to have me in his studio, but I got a lot out of it. So that was cool. Yeah. The jazz department was very jazz focused after that, but it was cool. It was really intense. It was a really intense place to learn about music. I think it was really a good place for me because I just needed to get good at the bass. I did.
Man, Rochester's cold. Last time I was there was decades ago, but it was like the end of June and it was freezing.
Oh, no. Funny because I when I was going to go to Rochester for school, everyone here said, oh, it's cold, look out. And then when I came to Rochester, I said I was from Chicago and all the Rochester people were like, oh, Chicago's so cold, look out. From one to the other, it was a wash.
I love Chicago. I feel like if it can still be underrated, I feel as though it is. It's such a wonderful place. But I do sort of have this policy of like, there's very narrow windows of the calendar year when I'll go there because it gets so cold. And we're sort of nearing the end of when I'll go. The next 4 to 6 weeks might be the end of when I would be willing to visit. It's such a beautiful city, though.
It is. Yeah. And it feels so like I grew up in a suburb of Chicago and my parents are both Chicagoans. And I didn't think I would be here forever because I wanted to play jazz. And so I was going to go to one of the coasts and that was the idea. So I moved to Chicago after school just for a year-long internship at the Jazz Institute of Chicago. And I figured then I would go do something. But when you're 18, you don't know what the jazz scene is like in a city because you can't even go to the places where it exists,
Yeah.
Once I was here and I started looking around and educating myself about this place that I'm in, it was like, oh, this is the kind of music I'm interested in. And I like the way that people are talking about music and the values that people have here and the way that they're approaching music feels really resonant with me. I was sheepish about how I was going to just be here and bounce. And now I'm 100% here forever now. This is a really special place that fits really beautifully with how I think about music and community and stuff like that.
Could we explore that a little more? I'd love to know what some of those resonances are. I'm so fascinated about the idea of place as it relates to artists and where they work and the choices they make and the choices that become available to them, but because of place. Especially you mentioned the word values. What's resonant there for you?
I heard an interview one time with a friend and mentor of mine, Mike Reed. He was talking about Chicago as being a place where it's not a place that and I'm going to paraphrase quote, this is what I remember it being. Chicago not being a place that you go to be famous, or it's not a place if you're seeking jazz fame that's very conducive to that. Like you said, Chicago's underrated. I think it might be under radared. You can, in some ways, it's it gives you the space to be left alone and to work on the things that you are interested in an environment that is able to hold it. If I dream up a new band, I could certainly put it together and present that music in a few different places without concern. You know what I mean? There's enough space here where it doesn't feels like there's a ton of different scenes that you could be a part of within the scene. There's a kind of a value in collaboration. There's a value in having a lot of freedom within the music. I have generally been welcomed into the improvised world in a really warm and encouraging way. I feel like I play with people that aren't just my age, and there's enough of these little smaller pockets or orbits of music making that you can be in a few of them without it being hostile.
Yeah.
For me, it has felt really open-handed. I don't feel pressured to sound a certain way. I like it.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. If you're interested in contributing to bonus tracks, the official blog of this podcast, visit spotlightonpodcast.com and click Call for Submissions. That's where we post details on what we're currently looking for and how to be considered. And now, back to Spotlight On. You talked about if you had an idea or if you fired up a project, there'd be some stages to go play on. I assume that also means there's places, there's players, but there's also audience. You find that there's appetite.
I think so. I mean, I feel like there's a really beautiful crew of people that love the music, and I learn a lot from them too. There's a whole scene of photographers that come and take pictures at shows, and it feels sustainable.
It's certainly not lacking in tradition.
Totally.
I mean, there's such a legacy of whether it's avant-garde or just it's a study in 20th century and beyond music. It's an incredible place.
Yeah.
How did you and James meet?
I think we first played when I subbed for his church music band. It was kind of a funny context for two improvisers to be playing because it was a very specific style of music. I think James was just playing keyboards. So we met, I played a bass, and then I think our first play time was a trio thing. James had been commissioned to write something for the Archibald Motley art exhibit that was happening at the Cultural Center. And we played some music there. And then our first band moment, there was a 9 duos night and at Constellation in Chicago. Yeah, it was kitschy. And so I was asked to pick a duo partner and play a short improvised thing. That was pretty soon after James and I had done the church thing and we had played a little bit. I was like, oh, it would be like, should I ask James? Because he's a little bit older than I am and he's more of a cat on the scene. And I was like, I don't know, is that weird? I felt like I was like asking him to prom or something. You know what I mean? I was like, would you maybe want to play a duo with me? And he was like, yeah, whatever, that's fine.
It's like, it's what I do.
I was like, oh, wow, thanks. And then I think when he saw who else was playing and it was like his peers, he was like, oh, we should rehearse. Let's get together. And so this doesn't sound bad. So we both brought in I think we each brought in a song or two and we improvised and talked about how we imagined it sounding. And it went well. It was cool. It was a pretty immediate blend of two distinct personalities. And I think the encouragement of it being a presentation for a lot of other improvisers, it was kind of like, hey, that was cool.
Yeah.
So then we played again and I think we were invited to play at the Hyde Park Jazz Festival. And that's how we got our band name, is because we needed to put a band name down.
Something on the poster.
Yeah. And we were doing a version of Wayfaring Stranger, and that seemed like a good kind of metaphor for the band. Then we were off. And then we're like, well, if we're going to play a gig, we should make a record. And if we have a record, we should play more shows. And then many years later, here we are.
Yeah. Tell me this, given all the different traditions that you both have functional experience in and knowledge of and facility with, how did the folk element present itself or rear its head? Like, that seems like those spooky, crazy melodies. And how did that become the focal point?
The focal point.
Well, after you did the 9/2 thing, I feel like it's free range. So
yeah, I think between James's Irish Celtic whistles and things and coming from like the hymn tradition, maybe that like the hymn folk song thing kind of emerged. And because I sing in the band and it's a pretty specific instrumentation, like these folk melodies that have like a drone underneath. I wonder if like the instrumentation also was like, oh, this works well as a vehicle for these kind of epic ballads of things. Or I think a lot of those real old melodies can handle being just the melody. They could be sung a cappella. I feel like folk music has been a persistent addition to a lot of the bands that I've been involved in, maybe because I sing in it. I think we also found a cool way of treating these kind of longer form songs. I'm thinking of our new record. We have a song that's an ancient Irish murder ballad called Who Put the Blood.
The showstopper.
It's just like, whoa.
That floored me. When you performed that in Seattle, I was like, I'm going on tour with these guys.
I mean, it's like, it's high drama. It really plays with the amount of density and space in relationship to the story that's being told. And that's my wheelhouse, I think, is being very like word focused. I don't use a ton of vibrato or ornament in my voice in those kinds of songs. It's really like classy. And then what happens around it being the thing that can be different from night to night. Yeah, it's a cool structure. I think we both feel good about that being a big part of our band.
The blood of a hare would never be so red. Son, tell it unto me. It's the blood of a boy that I killed yesterday, and I killed most manfully. Oh, I killed most manfully. What was between yourself and the boy? Son, tell it unto me. 'Twas mostly the cutting down of a rod that never would come to a tree, that never would come to a tree. What will you do when your daddy finds out? Son, tell it unto
When James and I spoke, we talked a bit about that. So the murder ballad as a form is so fascinating. I still am not sure I fully understand like why it exists as a form, like what the social purpose was that it was fulfilling. If it was a way to talk about scary things, or if it was entertainment, or if there were lessons being communicated. Like, do you have any sense of like what that's about? Like, why does that song exist?
Well, it's preserving the memory of it. Is it the CSI of its time?
Yeah, was it news?
It could be news. It's dramatic. It's high drama. There's a version of that song in like all the countries of the world. You know what I mean? Or is maybe like the most extreme thing. Like that is, you shouldn't murder generally across the humanity. And then what? In Who Put the Blood, it ends with, I'll just beg for mercy at the end of my life. And we've since added a different murder ballad to our set that is that song Two Sisters, or Oh, the Wind and the Rain. And that one ends with an unrepentant murdering sister. So there's two different versions where there's one who is remorseful at the end and one that has no remorse and just benefits greatly from a terrible sister side or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it seems to be a universal theme that you like to think that you wouldn't do that or be around that, but it also is such a human thing to sing about. It's intense.
Yeah, when I first heard the song, that was the first time I heard it, was when you performed it. And then when I went back and explored the record, because by the way, I went to the show pretty much unaware. It's a music series up here that's sort of like, I trust what they're curating, so I'm just going to go. It was one of the better choices I've made so far this year. When I went back and listened to the song, the narrator is this element of I just did it because I could, or I was curious about what it would feel like, or so, those are the kinds of things that were coming up. It was like it was a pointless murder.
Yeah.
Oh, chilling. Yeah, it's one thing if it's like a crime of passion or like, you stole my cow or like whatever it was, but it just, ooh.
Yeah. Which evokes a lot of immediate, like to say sexist murder, it evokes a certain feeling, and it is good to feel that thing.
Unrelated, but not, my significant other and I, we went away over the weekend to this very rural part of Washington, near a couple of hours from where we live. And we went to an old pioneer cemetery.
Yeah.
Nobody'd been buried there in quite a while. One of the tombstones was a husband and wife. It had the husband, his name, his date of birth, the wife, her name, date of birth. And then it said who were both murdered on and the date. I had never seen a tombstone like that. That was, sort of two people commemorating that incident. It was one of those things. It was like, there's a song there.
Which maybe is leading toward an answer to that question of why do we have these songs, is because there is such a visceral reaction to that. It feels that shouldn't be forgotten, or like, how could you do that? What are you going to do now that you've committed this crime? Like some group processing that it happens from hearing those songs or singing those songs or remembering those things, kind of memorializing the grosser parts of people.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that perspective, because it does give me a different context of the gravestone, of the grave marker, because just the fact that exists, that's the most important thing about those people's lives that any of us in the 21st century now know, that they died in this horrible act on the same day at the same time. They could have been buried side by side like any other grave with their own headstones, and like whatever it did to their community at that time, because it was probably a very small community. It was very rural. It was on the coast. It was at best a fishing town. Like it's a place that even now is barely developed. So it must have just run through their community.
That it's like, we cannot, we can't make this just a normal grave moment. It feels important to remember that or to deal with that.
Something else about the new Wayfaring record that is special to me as a listener is that it's one of those albums that every time I listen to it, I walk away and I'm like, oh, that's my favorite track now this time. Today, my favorite track was They Say There Wasn't Always Smoke.
Mm.
And you can never sort of necessarily articulate fully like why anything will stand out on any given point in time, but the interplay which I guess I spoke of earlier, but that seems to be the hallmark of that band. It's just the weaving that the two of you do with the instruments and with your voice. It's very special.
Yeah, thanks. It's an incredibly flexible unit to be two people because everything's inherently related to each other. There's things that are happening. But there's an interesting amount of structure versus freedom in the songs that we have. And like in that song that you're talking about, they say there wasn't always smoke. There is a set of like pitch material that we will eventually arrive at, but it can be at different rates. There's a part where I'm kind of like chasing the clarinet line with the bass part, and then we meet up. There's some kind of cool built-in choreography that feels different from show to show, but you'll probably hear those pitches. If you came to another show, you'd be like, oh, yeah. But the way that we would get to it would be different. So there's more structure to it than one might initially hear. But then when you listen to it again, or you hear it live and you hear the same components, it's like, oh, there's more of a skeleton than just nebulous thing. So I think James is really great at providing real clear structures upon which we improvise in a really specific way.
How long do you two need in order to fire it back up to be performance ready? Or is it like you land in the same city and you just go on stage? I can't figure that part of it out.
After our classic hiatus, we'll get together for like an afternoon of rehearsing before.
Wow.
But we had just done that run of things in the Pacific Northwest. And then a few weeks later or something, we played a show in Chicago. And we didn't really have to rehearse for that one as much. Whatever, doesn't matter. But as long as we both refresh our own roles, it's the familiarity you have with someone doesn't go away just because you haven't seen them in a little while. Kind of like how you could feel close to family that doesn't live in your immediate city. But when you go see them, the relationship is family and you can be at a certain comfort level.
It's so fascinating to talk to artists about topics like this because what is so second nature and in air quotes simple or obvious to them is sort of miraculous to the listener, right? Like the level of technique and the years of work that go into being able to not play with someone for weeks, never mind months, with such intricate arrangement and repertoire and adventurousness, to just be able to get together after an afternoon and do that. It seems so simple to you, or to the way you say it is so like, well, we had an afternoon. We had a whole afternoon.
Yeah. What?
Yeah. But to be the avatar of the audience, it's like, that's incredible to be able to fire it back up that way. If you had said to me, how long do you think it takes? I'd say, I don't know, you spent a week together, like 5 days of 4 or 5 hours a day. I don't know. That would have seemed right to me.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm impressed with like how you can have a podcast conversation with random people immediately. We didn't even prepare for this. Here we are.
Well, you didn't.
No, it's like I get my stuff together and James gets his.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's fair. I wanted to ask you a little bit about There's other set of themes that come up when I read about you and I read other interviews with you. I guess broadly under the role of like education. It seems to be an important part of what you do, being involved in arts education and thinking about sharing the tradition or the knowledge. Could you tell me a little bit about like, how did you stumble into that as being a value and how you fit that into your life as an artist?
It's been really great to find that there are ways to be involved very deeply in arts education without being a full-time teacher. And I feel really grateful that I haven't had to like make the choice of like, I can either work with young people or I can go be making my own music and they're separate. I feel very much a product of really beautiful, supportive arts education. The public school music program that I came up in was awesome and encouraging. And they had like a summer music camp scholarship that they'd give out to like a junior high kid. And so I got to go to jazzy string camp when I was 12. And there was support for young people to go and get better at music. I spent all 4 years of my high school summers going to a 2-week intensive jazz camp called Birch Creek Music Performance Center. And I've taught there now for many years. It really was a very performance-based education model where the faculty makes up a professional big band and they play concerts for the public. And then the students get to watch that. So they get to watch real gigs and they get to play a lot. And so I think I came up with this idea that like professional musicians teach you how to be a professional musician and you pass on what you know. Like it was a clear message to me as a young person that like mentoring and bringing up and supporting is like just what we do here. I have worked with like the Jazz Institute of Chicago's education programs. I'm like on their education committee. It feels so clear to me that I would not be the musician I am or be in the places that I am in without that huge, overwhelming support from a community of people older that didn't need to be supportive, but chose to be, that it feels just like a natural component of my life and practice. When I can, it's great to fuse those two things. Twin Talk is doing a residency at a college in Wisconsin next week, and we're going to be working with students and playing our music. And that's like a happy marriage of being an inspiring artist that's doing creative work and also being an educator that says you can get better at music or you can follow your own ideas. And it just feels quite essential to have that as a component of my practice, is to also be like, you should too. You should go start a weird band. In a time where it can really feel like you have to self-promote and self-manifest all of your things.
Yeah.
It is very important to remember that it's generally the people around you that lift you up or push you in a good direction or push you in a bad direction. And then you have to.
Yeah, there's learning there too.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I feel very strongly about how the environment that you're in can impact the quality of your life or your trajectory. So finding ways to make more people have a good environment is very important to me.
What are you seeing with the next generation of players? Are you seeing a lot of young women? Are you seeing diversity in other forms? Does it give you encouragement? I realize we'll never reach the summit of the work that needs to be done, but how do you feel?
I'll say I have done a lot of like guest artist type things, like guest clinicians at jazz festivals. And so I've seen a lot of high school big bands. When I was in high school, there were far fewer women per band. And there definitely weren't any women that were in the role that I am in now of being the clinician. I'm glad to be a part of it. And I understand the importance of just me being there as in the body that I have to connect with people is great. It feels like there's more, I see more girls playing the bass and it seems like we're going in a good direction. If anything, I view my role as like representative, as just to be, just to like the fact that I exist in my realm is like, there you go. There's your, be inspired. I'm going to make this music over here. You know what I mean? Like, we're still working towards the summit, like you said. But I definitely feel at least there's some questions being asked now of like, oh, well, maybe we should have a woman be clinicians sometimes too. I feel like there's a lot of really exciting young artists making things. My general messaging is to follow the things that light you up or the things that you're curious about. And if your music doesn't sound like other people's, that's awesome. And you should make it girl or boy, follow your curiosities, make your own adventure.
Yeah. Well, that's a great note to leave on. Thank you so much. It's great to connect with you.
Thank you. This was super fun.
And you have a gig tonight?
Yes, I'm playing with some French improvisers through this thing called the Bridge Project. So it's a Chicago and France exchange. We playing a set of improvised music. 2 great Chicago musicians, Nick Mazzarella and Tim Stein, and then 2 really great French musicians. And it'll be super fun.
Wow. So yeah, I noticed on your calendar, the Bridge is in there quite a bit. So that's something you do with some regularity, or you will be doing? Yeah,
it's basically a tour that's local. It's a tour for the French musicians, and it's kind of just a bunch of local things for us in Chicago. Idea being that we'll then go to France and play.
There you go.
Yeah.
Excellent. That sounds fun. We'll break a leg.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katie Ernst. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, with theme music by Q Burns Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, weekly postings on our official blog, and a ton more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.